So here's the thing about brown ales. They're not super exciting. They're not juicy. They're not sour. They're not low-cal. Think of a current beer trend, and I guarantee you brown ales are not that thing. But that doesn't mean they're not interesting. Important, even. Because they are. They are especially important to the American homebrewing revolution of the late 70s and early 80s. Along with APAs, American brown ales were among the first craft beers to really take hold in the marketplace. Unlike APAs, browns were wholly different from the macro offerings at the time. They were darker, denser, and richer, with notes of caramel and chocolate and toast. These beers were a godsend for people who didn't care for the fizzy yellow beers that were the norm. It's not shocking, though, that brown ales never reached the level of popularity that APAs and IPAs have enjoyed for so long. It seems that your typical beer nerd falls into one of two camps: Team Hops or Team Malts. People on Team Hops don't give a good goddamn about brown ales. They find them boring and pointless. And the people on Team Malts typically go for bolder flavors, like those you find in stouts or porters. They will drink brown ales, sure, but few of them will fall in love with brown ales. At best, it's a style that is good, not great, in most people's estimation. But here at Beer Barrels and Blockbusters, we treat all beer styles equally. We try to, anyway. So with that in mind, let's get into the style guidelines. We'll read the overall impressions bit. It says, a malty but hoppy beer, frequently with chocolate and caramel flavors. The hop flavor and aroma complements and enhances the malt rather than clashing with it. And that's it. Short and sweet. Not a lot to be said about brown ales overall, it seems. Like I said, they are not incredibly complicated. But sometimes it's the simple things that bring us the most joy. Let's get into it. The aroma on your typical American brown ale ranges from malty sweet to malty rich, with notes of chocolate, caramel, toast, or nuttiness. That's going to be the main attraction here. The hop aroma is muted, typically low to moderate, and rarely features the citrusy tropical notes you would normally associate with New World hops. Sometimes you will run into a brown ale that hits the hop note harder than most, but they're outliers. The malt and hops are generally balanced. Fruity esters are moderate to very low, which is one of the big differences between the American and British versions of brown ales. A British brown ale offers a lot more in the way of esters, whereas the American brown ale employs a much cleaner yeast profile. The American one also has a more robust, dark malt character, sometimes stopping just short of being considered a porter. Appearance-wise, these beers are light to very dark brown. They are clear, which is sometimes hard to deduce with them being dark beers. And they have a low to moderate head that is tan in color. The guide here says off-white to tan head, but that's like splitting hairs. I'm just gonna say tan head. Brown ales have a medium to moderately high malty sweet or malty rich flavor. That's a weird sentence, I know. Essentially, they are malty brown beers, and the intensity of that maltiness will vary from beer to beer. Some lean to the sweet side, while others are more nutty, but they will all have some kind of chocolate, caramel, nutty, and/or toasty malt complexity with medium to medium high levels of bitterness. They will have a medium to medium dry finish that will have a nicely balanced ratio of malt to hops. The aftertaste will be fairly even in that regard. The hop flavor can be light to moderate and may have some New World character, citrusy tropical notes, etc., but really any hop flavor that complements the malt is acceptable. And like I said before, the fruity esters will be very low to moderate. Mouthfeel is going to be medium to medium full body. Some of the more bitter versions may have a dry, resinous impression, and they will have moderate to moderately high carbonation. That's kind of a running theme with brown ales. They are medium to medium high across the board. It's a very medium kind of beer style. It's like a summer blockbuster, designed to appeal to as many people as possible. Best case scenario, it's going to be very good. Worst case scenario, it's going to be very forgettable. Never life-changing, but never awful. Right down the middle. Some brewers like to overhop their brown ales. These are maybe closer to the homebrewed originals from back in the day, but to your modern beer drinker, they would be considered more of a brown IPA than American brown ale. Brown ales, in and of themselves, have been around for centuries. London brewers were making them in the late 1600s. Back then, pretty much all beer was cloudy and brown. But once technology allowed for lagering and filtration to clean up a beer's appearance, brown beers took a backseat to crisp, clear pale ales and lagers. It wasn't until 1925 that brown ales came back into fashion with the introduction of Newcastle Brown Ale. But that's a British brown ale. The American brown ale didn't come along until much later. There were brown ales in America back in the day too, but they were similar to their British counterparts, and none of them really survived Prohibition. But then we flash forward to 1986, when Pete Schlossberg took his homebrewed brown ale recipe commercial and essentially reinvented the American brown ale style with the advent of Pete's Wicked Ale. In fact, I would say that most American brown ales made to this day use Pete's Wicked Ale as their general template. Some of them tweak their versions with additions of coffee or hazelnuts or a bit of smoke, but for the most part, a brown ale is a brown ale. If someone hands you one, you have a pretty good idea what's in store for you. That's a really short history lesson, but there's not much else to say. This is a beer style that was perfected long ago and remains a stalwart style for brewers today. Just don't expect any of them to knock your socks off. So, as far as characteristic ingredients are concerned, American brown ales tend to favor well-modified pale malt, plus crystal and darker malts, typically chocolate malt. American hops are typical, but any New World hops or even some continental European hops are acceptable. American brown ales have more chocolate and caramel flavors than an APA or American Amber, and they have a less prominent bitterness. Remember, they favor the malt, not the hops. As such, they are less bitter and less alcoholic, and not as hoppy as a brown IPA, even though they may look similar. And the biggest similarities you'll find will be between American and British brown ales, but the American version is, of course, more hoppy, with a cleaner yeast character, a richer malt presence, usually a higher ABV, and an American or New World hop character. APAs and American Ambers will also just look different than a brown ale, but with brown IPAs and British Browns, it will take more than a cursory glance to spot the difference. What else? I feel like we're flying through this one. So, IBU range on an American brown ale is 20 to 30, which is, again, straddling the middle. SRM is listed as 18 to 35, which would be kind of an amber, kind of brown, to a deep, dark brown. And the ABV ranges from 4.3 to 6.2%, right down the middle. I feel like I'm being dismissive of brown ales, and I don't want you to think that they're not worth seeking out. Brown ales are very tasty beers. Some of my favorites are the Ellie's Brown Ale, Rogue Hazelnut Brown, and Bell's Best Brown, which is a fall seasonal. Same with New Holland's Cabin Fever. That might actually be a winter seasonal. I don't remember. Cigar City's Maduro Brown is a very rich, robust brown ale that I really like. And of course, being in St. Louis, I have to give a shout out to Civil Life and their delicious American Brown. There are tons of American brown ales out there. I think people ignore them because they think they're boring. But like I said when we did APAs, just because it seems like a very basic style doesn't mean you won't enjoy drinking it. Simple doesn't mean boring. There's a lot of interplay here between bitter, piney hops and rich, chocolatey malts. These dissonant flavors can come together in a really nice way, and I would hate for you to miss out on all the great brown ales out there because you're chasing that flashy new beer style. New beers are exciting, sure, but there's already so many great beer styles out there that it seems silly not to give them all a shot. Some of them may speak to you on a spiritual level, opening you up to things you never would have thought you'd be into. I never would have thought I'd like a sour beer. I never liked sour candy as a kid, like Warheads or Sour Patch Kids. I thought that shit was nasty. But then I started trying sour beers and I was hooked. So don't bring any preconceptions into the tasting room, is what I'm getting at. Beer always has the ability to surprise you. Oh, another one I like is Velvet Underbrown from St. Louis brewery Heavy Riff. It's an extra dark, almost roasty brown ale, very tasty. A lot of people say Heavy Riffed because they can't read or follow context clues, but it's Heavy Riff. That's why they have guitars and shit on their labels. And their beers are all named after rock songs or bands. Fucking figure it out, people. Anyway, I think it's time to check in with Thomas and see what he thinks about American brown ales. Like I said earlier, this style was one of the big ones for homebrewers back in the 70s and 80s. And as far as I know, it continues to be a great beer for newbies to experiment with. It is a very forgiving style. So let's take a break, and we'll go visit with Thomas for a bit.